Hello, I'm John Brink, and we are podcasting on the Brink from central British Columbia, Canada. And for all those people watching us from around the world, they say, oh, we know where Canada is, in British Columbia on the west coast, right? Right, that's where it is. Beautiful, beautiful province and a beautiful, beautiful country. So today we got a very, very interesting guest. His name is Bryan Rigg. Bryan is a Yale graduate and a Cambridge-trained historian specializing in World War II, the Holocaust, and the intersection of religion and history. A former professor at SMU, Southern Methodist University, retired U.S. Marine Corps officer, a veteran of the Israeli Defense Force. He has conducted archive research in 18 archives across 5 countries. Rigg is an award-winning author of multiple books, and we'll talk about that. Hitler Jewish Soldiers is one. The Rabbi Saved by Hitler's Soldiers is another. Flamethrower, Japanese Holocaust, and A Case Against Christ. Bryan, amazing bio. Share with us a bit of your history. Where did it all start, and how then did you go through the process of being an amazing educator at Yale, and then followed by, obviously, the Southern Methodist University? Tell us about it. How did it all start?
Well, thanks. Well, thanks, John. Thanks for that warm introduction. Honored to be on your show. In 1992, a few years had gone by since the Iron Curtain had fallen, and a lot of my ancestors from Germany had come from what was, the previous DDR, the communist section of Germany. So I was interested to go back to Germany and learn about where my ancestors lived, who they were, etc. So in 1992, I went to Berlin, started studying German history, the German language. And at the end of that summer, I went to some of the small cities in Saxony and Brandenburg that, were now open to me. And during the course of that research, I found out that I had a lot of Jews in my family branches that I'd never known about before. And so that started getting me thinking at that time, why did my family hide their Jewish ancestry? What would have happened to us had we remained in Germany? And so that was one part of the catalyst to go into World War II and the Holocaust. The other amazing event that happened to me that summer was I saw a film called Europa, Europa. It's on Netflix. It's a very good film about World War II, and it's about Shlomo Perel, who just actually died a few years ago in Israel. And it's a remarkable story of his life, of how he found himself in the Nazi military and how he survived that experience. And when I watched this film in Germany, I had sat next to an elderly gentleman. And during the course of the film, we were basically the only ones in the theater, and he was interpreting the film for me. And after this film about Shlomo Perel, a Jew in the Nazi military, I asked this gentleman next to me, Peter Milius, what he thought about the film. And he said, it's very close to my own history. Would you like to go talk? I said, sure. So we went to a bar and we talked about his life during the whole evening. And it turned out that Peter was of Jewish descent and served in the Nazi military. So these two events this summer of 1992 got me thinking, okay, how many more people of Jewish descent were in the Nazi military? And why did my family hide their Jewish ancestry? What does it mean to be Jewish? And how did this thing called the Holocaust happen? And that set me on a journey of the next basically 8 years. I studied intensely German military history, the Holocaust, and I ended up interviewing over 400 men of Jewish descent who served in the Nazi military. And that was my PhD at Cambridge University, called Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, and subsequently my first book. So that's how I got into World War II, the Holocaust, and exploring these deep issues that humanity struggles with: mass murder, intolerance, fascism, and how do we get to a better society?
And then other things relating to that is, where does religion fall into all of that as well, likely? is because it is a lot of times the driver behind all the troubles and struggles along the way. So the other part that comes to mind is that, as you mentioned, when things changed in Europe, in particular Eastern Europe, Eastern Germany, I believe it was President Reagan that said, President Khrushchev, take down that wall. That I remember well, and I still see the pictures of people with axes and saying, how can they possibly do it? But determination, taking down the wall, that changed. The other part that comes to mind is Romania, where they could just you in 89, I believe, I may not have the name correctly, when he was standing there on that balcony and gave a presentation to tens of thousands of his people that as a dictator he had been abusing in many ways, and tried then, he could feel the people were turning against them, which they did. He fled, tried to get out of there together with his wife in a helicopter. That didn't work, and they brought him back, and within days had a court case of some description, and they were both shot death, and it changed Romania. That, to me, was a positive move as well. So I remember those parts. And then, obviously, as you already said, I was born in 1940, and northeastern Europe, within 10 minutes from the German border, in November of 1940. And I remember well, looking back, is that my mom and dad were married when they were 38 years old. They were in love, and my dad worked in a little lumber company, and so they had rented a duplex, and then the dictator called Adolf Hitler in 1939-38, they decided that Poland should become part of Germany, and it became obvious that he would not stop there. He was the obsessive individual, Adolf Hitler. And so my dad then, and my mom had now two little kids already, one born in 1938, the other in 1939, and being pregnant with me, my dad was called into the Dutch army, and so in April of 1940, and the last time they saw him was just before the bombing of Rotterdam, and Hitler didn't find that Holland capitulated quick enough for his liking, so he bombed that city, this amazing city called Rotterdam, and thousands of people died. And for the next 5 years, they would not know, my mom would not know if he lived or if he died. So she was on her own, living through the difficult period of being occupied by the German army. And the first thing that I remember is that bombs or aircraft overhead bombing the German infrastructure that touched on the western part of Germany, that touches on the North Sea, and Wilhelmshaven and Hamburg, and all of those cities. And we would be standing on the deck on top of our house, looking outside towards Germany, and the sky be red of the cities burning. And the reason my mom did that, she felt safer outside than inside. And so that's the first thing I remember. The second thing that I remember is, as a little kid, it was in 1944 in particular, he had cut off all the food supply to Holland. And so between my brother, my sister, and myself, every morning we would go with gunny sacks into the railroad yards, pick up anything edible and burnable. And so we did that. And then the winter 1944-45 was the coldest on record And so I still can feel even now the feeling, 80 years later, I can feel the feeling of hunger, cold, and anxiety, and still have PTSD. Got counseling in my 50s for the inner child. And I remember still, even now, Bryan, that people were dragged out of their houses, in particular the Jewish community and that lived in our city, or anybody else young enough that could go into work camps, and then the Jewish people would be dragged in and sent to, the concentration camps to be murdered there. And for all the people, put it into perspective, 6 million Jewish people were murdered or killed by that regime. And then the total amount of people affected by this war, the Second World War, 60 million people died, 6-0. And saying, but I'm afraid of now more than anything that history will repeat itself. We should have learned the lesson, because there is nothing more important than trying at all costs preserve peace. And because so quickly these things get out of hand and they become then another World War III potentially, and looking to now, from my perspective, I was there, I did it, I see what happened to families like in our case, that for all those people, with all due respect, they think that if it is war, once the war is over, everything goes back to normal. It doesn't. It may last generations, including mine and beyond, that will be affected by it. So, and if I look now at the world, I look at the Ukraine, comes to mind, Russia comes to mind, I look at the Middle East, I look at Venezuela, I look at North Korea, I look at China, and I can just go on and on and on. And particularly what is on my mind now is, Iran, obviously, in the Middle East, and Israel, Gaza come to mind, and all of those things. We are, in my mind, on the potential doorsteps of another world war. And I don't want to scare people, but I've seen it, I've been there, and history will repeat itself, and particularly, not making this political, if people become impulsive, not thinking clearly about where do we go from here, it is an extremely dangerous period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you totally. I like what Mark Twain says, a phrase that's attributed to him, is that maybe history doesn't repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes.
Yeah.
And so, we have the enduring legacy of humanity is violence, and that's the only language that people truly understand. And that's why, the famous Roman phrase, if you want peace, prepare for war. And so, unfortunately, that's where we're at right now. And, for all the people who preach peace, which I believe in firmly, that is a goal to strive for. And we've seen it remarkably in Europe, the last 60, 70 years, compared to what had happened the last 200 years leading up to that, a remarkable time of peace. But we have a lot of bad actors on the world stage: North Korea, Russia, Iran, a lot of Islamic states. Thank God they don't have an industrial complex behind them. But if they did, they are fascist in their mindset. They're very intolerant. They don't believe in women's rights, gay rights, democratic values. And so the only way to deal with them is with violence, unfortunately. And God help us if a lot of these intolerant regimes get nuclear weapons. You better believe, had Japan, Imperial Japan or Nazi Germany had nuclear bombs, they would have used them indiscriminately.
No question.
Yeah. So I think that's one thing that World War II teaches us with what's going on now, is that when you have an enemy, you have to, especially if it's fascist, intolerant, totalitarian, you have to absolutely destroy it. And luckily, with the Marshall Plan, we built back up Germany, Europe, and we built back up Japan. And now these two countries are some of our strongest allies. So we do have a model from history of how to build a better world to some degree. But these nations were able to take that. We tried it in Afghanistan and Iraq, and it doesn't work with many respects Islamic nations.
Allow me to make one comment, I get so excited about having you on this because of all the things that we have in common. So, if I look back, correct me if I am wrong, Byron, is that in 1944, June of 1944, the Allied forces, the United States, Canada, UK, landed on Normandy at great cost to liberate Western Europe and the rest of Europe from the German army, and they landed at great cost. The Americans want east and south. The Canadians want north through France, through Belgium, and western part of Holland, and to the top of Holland where I lived, and I still remember it well. We were liberated by the Canadian Army April the 12th, 1945, and it made such an impression on me as a 5-year-old that I knew when I grew up I would go to the land of my heroes, Canada, and I did. And so the other part that I was going to add to it, as you already mentioned, is that after the destruction of war and all the infrastructure that had been destroyed, it was the United States, Canada, and other, and the UK that started the Marshall Plan that you referred to, related to rebuild Western Europe, and they did. And then from there on, and what followed is NATO. And that became then a change of bringing the democratic countries and democratic thinking countries together as a unit. Under Article 5, you attacked one, you attacked all concept, although there's somewhat in question sometimes. But that then became the stabilizing force, at least in my mind. And then, and then the other part, I was born there in northeastern Holland. I was there till I was 24, was drafted into the Dutch Air Force, spent 2 years being trained in special forces, a good exercise. But at the same time, during that period and beyond, that the EU, the European community, opened their borders to each other. I could not even then, when I was imagine that I would drive from Holland straight into Germany or any of the other countries. So it became a model of what it can be, and what I believe as I look forward, I look to in North America between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, an amazing continent, in my view, that has huge opportunity, not in terms of wealth, democratic rule, but also in terms of stabilizing the rest of the world, to work together under the NATO umbrella, and especially in northern and the continent of North America as the United States, Canada, and Mexico as one unit.
Yeah, we are getting better as a society of working with each other. I mean, you just bring up Europe, which is amazing. You go from the 30 Years' War where they're slaughtering each other because they're either Protestant or Catholic, and that's only like 10, 12 generations ago. That's nothing. And there was 30 million people that died between 1618 and 1648. And of course, as you mentioned, 60 million people during World War II. We haven't seen that bloodshed since. Now, could we? Unfortunately, yes. With nuclear weapons being in a pathetic nation's hands like Russia or Pakistan, and God forbid if Iran ever got a weapon, it would be disastrous. So we do have the potential to mirror World War II as far as the death toll, and we need to come together as nations and work together. The stress between Canada and America recently, I think, is unfounded. Canada is one of our strongest partners. We have the same institutions. Canadian soldiers that you mentioned, they were some of the best of World War II. And they had the third largest Navy in World War II. So they are incredible, resourceful people. and we should continue to have strong ties with Canada and enforcing peace, especially in our realm of the world. I think Mexico is a harder nation to deal with. I mean, they have really pathetic institutions that are very corrupt. They have the drug lords that are running rampant. I personally think that we should start doing what Trump says and take out the cartel positions, because Mexico's not doing it. They're too weak.
Yeah.
Now, as far as getting to a more globalized focus on deterrence, Europe, I think, is starting to wake up that they have to pay more for their defense. You know, the Bundeswehr, the German military, is not even as big as the United States Marine Corps, which, I'm a member of. And so, the United States Marine Corps could theoretically take over Germany. We have more. In fact, I heard recently that we have more aircraft than the Bundeswehr, the United States Marine Corps. So Germany needs to get their act together. And, whenever they say never again, nie wieder, talking about the Holocaust, and then you have, genocides and mass murders in Rwanda or on their doorstep in Yugoslavia, stuff going on in Ukraine, and they don't do anything. That's something that they've gone too much on the other extreme of being too pacifist. So we have to embolden Europe to take more stronger action, have stronger militaries and better cooperation with us, because we've also had some bizarre politics like with Greenland and so on, which doesn't make any sense. We have full reign there. Greenland is given, and Denmark is working with us. They're our allies. So, kind of everything that we're talking about, I mean, it's a lot better world than it was 100, 200 years ago, as far as the anger and the wars and things of that sort going on. The new thing that we have to be careful of is chemical warfare, biological warfare, and then nuclear weapons. And how you deal with that is something I don't think we have actually got our heads around properly from a diplomatic point of view, from a cultural point of view. That we have Russia with so many nuclear warheads, and China and Pakistan. These are very bad actors in the world.
North Korea,
Kim Jong-un. So, it reminds me of the famous phrase from E.B. White, of Charlotte Webb fame. He said, "Every morning I wake up and there's a side of me that wants to enjoy the world, and there's a side of me that wants to save it, and it makes planning for the day difficult."
Exactly.
But discussing these issues are very important. And I think NATO, as you were mentioning, the UN, these are examples of what we should be focusing on. And we need to make these institutions and alliances a lot stronger. And they're not as strong as they need.
In the EU, an amazing way of working together. Now, the other part that I was going to mention, just kind of looking at the world from my perspective, is that I look at the Middle East and again looking at places like Afghanistan, obviously Iran, I look at Syria, Jordan, all those things, and the mixture of religion in particular. And with all due respect, I'm a Christian. I'm not actively pursuing a particular church direction, but that's who I am. And so I believe in peace and tranquility and respect. But what I see in the Middle East is that if I look at Iran as the Shiites, and then look at the Sunnis, and then think back at the war between Iraq and the Iran, hundreds of thousands of people died simply because the ones were Sunnis, the other ones were Shiites. And if I have this correct, several hundreds of years ago, a particular nephews did not get into a position they should have been, and they still, something like that. I don't understand it fully, but again, and then looking at Syria, although there is some stability for some reason or another, and Jordan in particular, that used to be immensely successful And then but again, it's the mixture of different influence, in particular Iran, likely looking at Israel, the only democratic country really in the Middle East, and fighting the battles. And so there is still, where do we go from here as it applies to Iran? And I believe, and I agree with you, what you say is that it cannot get to the point where it gets control, because that will be devastating, and it certainly will include potentially atom bombs.
Yeah, unfortunately, the more I study Islam, the less I find that I respect of it. I mean, it does not embrace religious freedom. It does not embrace human rights. It does not embrace gay rights. It does not embrace women's rights. Now, Christianity for the longest time had this, but secular governments had to discipline it. When you had theocracies like the Crusades and so on, or the 30 Years' War, Christianity did not behave very well at all. And it was the secular governments that disciplined it, and then also said, hey, religious freedom, like in America. You know, if you want to be Jewish, if you want to be Catholic, if you want to be Protestant, we're going to work to live together. Islam has not done that. Canada, Canada the same way, England, anything under common law, really. New Zealand, Australia, you know, when you start looking at different laws, you know, Napoleonic law, Spanish law, those countries are much more corrupt. South America, Spain, Portugal, not very good law. Common law, English law, very good. Japan, New Zealand, and so on. When you get to Islamic law, it is a fascist way of looking at society. It is not a tolerant way. We don't see people flooding the borders of many Muslim countries to get in there because they have religious freedom and democratic rights and so on. So we have to be non-politically correct, if you will, when we see the dangers of what's out there and what they promote. They will kill each other just because somebody will leave the religion. You know, that's in the Quran. It's a dynastic rule that it has, and it's split off with the nephew, as you mentioned, and that's the Shia and the Sunni. So they both have these different competing Islams. They hate each other, but they hate infidels more. So we need to take example like from Hitler. When Hitler comes on the scene and says, we have the right way, everybody else is wrong, and if you don't agree with us, we're going to kill you. The only way you can deal with that type of society is destroy it. And in many respects, a lot of Islamic cultures that are promoting this chaos, terrorism, and so on, like I think we need to have a Nuremberg trials for Hamas. They need to lay down their arms. We need to have trials, and we need to have executions of them, or Hezbollah. And Iran is the same way. So history teaches us that when you're dealing with fascist regimes that are extremely intolerant, which Iran is one example of many of Islamic branches, Hezbollah, Jihad, Hamas, etc. You got to be brutal with them, and you got to force on them a culture of religious freedom, separation of church and state, which is what we did after World War II. You know, if you were to ask me what was the most dangerous religion 70, 80 years ago, I would say it's the Catholic Rite. I mean, people forget out of the 7 major dictators of World War II, 6 of them were Catholic, you know, in the Western realm. Mussolini and Hitler, the first treaties they did was with the Vatican, the Lateran Accords in 1922 and the Reichskonkordat in 1933, to legitimize their rule in the eyes of the whole world. And when the Pope sanctioned these rules, it was like the vicar of Christ. It was like God saying, we sanction this. And that was a very dangerous movement, very anti-Semitic. Before Vatican II, 1962 to 65, Nostra Aetate, you had an official preachment that all Jews in perpetuity were guilty of deicide and that they were the firstborn of Satan. They were the corruptors of society. And this was preached to all these Catholic leaders in the Nazi hierarchy. And that created, in part, the Holocaust that we now know about. Now we have preachers in the Islamic world preaching that this is the only way to live. If you don't agree with us, we're going to kill you. Very bad thing for a society that wants to embrace humanistic values of what is hateful to you, do not do to others. Treat each other with kindness. Treat each other with tolerance of being open to other ideas, but being very intolerant of intolerance, which that is the Islamic society in general. When you look at a lot of these nations like Iran, extremely intolerant.
Afghanistan.
Taliban, horrible. I mean, they're preventing women from going to school. You have an affair, the man doesn't get punished, but the woman gets her head cut off. If you're gay, they throw you off towers. And if you leave the religion, you're killed. I mean, the Taliban is a horrid, horrid organization.
So the thing that gets me to a certain extent, Bryan, from a layperson looking inward, is saying that I look at Iran, probably I believe about 90, 91, 92 million people, a big, big country with lots and lots of people, but ruled by ayatollahs, and starting in, I forget now exactly when the first one came back from some, there was not necessarily a democratic rule before that, and saying, where do they go? Now they have destroyed the structure of the present Ayatollah and the people around him, is that when do the people, ultimately it is the people of the country that have to collectively stand up and say no more. And to a certain extent, the women did this last year or the year before, I forget now when, and the men do it. Now, obviously, there is all the reasons in the world now is to stand up. At what point do we, whoever we is, together say, let them now make the right decision, that obviously under the Ayatollahs, that rule is very brutal and unforgiving, as it is with the Taliban in Afghanistan. At what point do the people stand up and say no more?
You know, some people did try that in Nazi Germany, and they got killed. Some people did that in fascist Italy, and they got killed. A few people, not many, did that in Japan. They get slaughtered. So when you have an organization within itself that has
same
control,
in China.
China right now, especially under Mao Tse-tung. When you talk about mass murders, Mao Tse-tung has the gold medal. I mean,
and that's the point.
According to Young and Holloway's biography of him recently, minimum, they're thinking 35 million to 70 million people got slaughtered underneath him. So people rising up against
under
Russia,
Stalin, Lenin.
Stalin, 20 million. Yeah, 20 million under Stalin, and Putin, has killed off a lot of people. Not at the level of Stalin, but he's just as bad. So, I mean, we have a lot of bad actors. The best way to deal with them is to try to kill them, obviously, and take away their infrastructure of control. Now, Iran, Persians in general are usually very intellectual, very hardworking people. I'm a little surprised, unlike Arab countries, that the people are less sophisticated in general, not as educated as the Persians. And I'm doing broad generalizations, but this is from my experience and some of my reading. The Persians, I'm surprised they have not been more effective. Now, we have some sins that we have to atone for, America, because we removed
Persians is Iran.
Persians are Iran. And most Iranians don't like being called Iranians. They like being called Persians.
Yes, just to make sure.
We made a mistake of removing Musadah from power, who was a democratically elected leader in Iran, because he was dealing too much with the Soviets. And then we placed the Shah in command. And the Shah did a lot of good things, but he also was a brutal dictator, and he was a secular brutal dictator. And then that's what the people rose up against him. So the Persians have a history of rising up and deposing a bad person. But the Ayatollah came in 79 and 80 and seized power and then controlled the network of government. Can the Persians rise up and go against that? We're helping them out an awful lot by cutting off the head of the snake. I sure hope they rise up, but they're not armed. They're not well organized. They have voices that they've gone out in the street. According to some human rights
Do they have
groups,
a leader other than the son of the last Shah? Who
well, the
will
good news, and
become
it's
the
some of this
leader?
recent who's going to rise up? And I don't think they have a person that they can really point to. Now, the son of the Shah right now was just interviewed, and he said he would want to do an intern government. He's not interested in bringing back like dynastic rule and royal rule. So that's a good thing to hear from him, that he wants to set up something democratically, and hopefully he would stick to that. So, when people rise up against their oppressors, a lot of times it doesn't go well. But in the cases where it has gone well, like what we see in America, rising up against the British Empire at that time, setting up our institutions and our nation, which was in question for many years in the 1770s and 1780s. There are precedents for that, but the people have to want it. They have to be armed to be able to fight against the oppressors. And so getting to that example from the independence, the War of Independence that we had versus what Persians are faced with, it's a very tough road that they're going to be faced with seizing the government. There is a way, there are leaders to do so. Will they be able to? That's the big question right now that the future will only be able to tell us.
So where that brings me now, Bryan, at least in my view, if I look at North America, in particular Canada and the United States, but focusing on the United States, that I believe, you correct me if I am wrong, it was 13 colonies that got together and formed the United States. I believe it was 250 years it will be celebrated. I believe it is July the 4th, correct me if I'm wrong, that created and the constitution of this amazing country called the United States that went through all those things to get to the point of the example and the leaders of the free world 250 years ago. Is and their constitution starts with the three words: we the people is the foundation. So where are we? Are we still, and I know I don't want to get into the politics of today so much other than to say, no, Canada will not become the 51st state. And so, I love Canada, but I love the United States as well. We are all immigrants. We're all the same. We are as similar as you can possibly get it. That's the way it will be, not always tomorrow and the next day, but for the long term, it will always be that way, and I like it. But just your comments about that is saying that going through the forming the foundation for the United States, the 13 colonies that got together and then wrote that constitution and became what we now know as the United States, the leader, if you wish, of the free world and the example of the free world and the Constitution, starting with we the people, and obviously there are elements of it that sometimes are in question. Now again, we have the Senate and we have the House. There will be midterm elections that will make corrections when appropriate. I'm not saying that they should, or I'm not speculating on that, but it has those elements of that. I don't think nothing will change the foundation of the United States Constitution, that we, the people, will decide as to what will we be and where do we go from here.
As you're talking this way into discussing about the Constitution in America, for all the warts and problems that we have with our leaders, from being struggling with leadership like General Grant did with Reconstructionism era, looking at what Eisenhower in the Cold War was dealing with, what Carter was with inflation. Sometimes you have very good people, I think, morally, like Jimmy Carter or Obama, but we're weak leaders. Sometimes you have great leaders like Bill Clinton who were moral failures, et cetera, et cetera. I like what Winston Churchill, which was half American, by the way. Many people don't realize his mother, Jenny, was an American. But he said, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he basically said, American democracy is the worst form of government except for all the rest. We've given the world an example of how people can rule, people can come together from different walks of life, and we can meet, et pluribus unum, out of many, one. And, so we will continue to do that, even with our flawed leaders that we have, continually put up there. And we have transparency, freedom of the press, and we have a strong military, and we have most often used our military to help oppress people, whether it be in Kosovo, whether it be in Herzegovina, against Serbia, whether Nazi Germany, Japan. We've been misguided sometimes, in how we do things, but we're trying to do our best to preserve, in general, human rights and democracy. And that's one thing with Iran, you can say there's a lot of arguments to be made that this was a very good thing. Even Venezuela, the methods are bizarre. Most historians and political scientists are just shaking their heads. But ultimately, like several people have said on the left and right that I've heard, that had we killed Hitler in 1935, this world would be a better place. And so taking out the Ayatollah right now, this world is a better place having less religious nut jobs than more in power. So I think American democracy still is a very powerful example of what nations should strive for. And getting back to Churchill's, quote, I think we are continually doing more good than we are harm in the world.
I agree with that, Bryan, but they cannot do it alone. To be under a strong umbrella of NATO is critically important.
I agree.
At the risk of being political, to suggest to take over Canada as the 51 states is not the right thing to do. You cannot do it alone. And to take the people that have a history of being their friends and supporters, because Kosovo and all the other ones, Canadians were there and their friends were there. They must take the approach and accept the fact that you cannot do it alone.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a dear friend that his grandmother said something very wise, and she said, a fool is a person who makes enemies out of friends. That's what, with Greenland and Denmark and in Canada, you're seeing. Now, what's interesting, I talked to a good buddy of mine who's attached to a NATO command. He's a German naval officer. He's attached to NATO command in the north of Germany. And he says, for all this weird chess playing that Trump does, he says it's always kind of interesting of the unintended consequences that happen. Now, do I think Trump is as smart of thinking 5 or 6 movements ahead about what I'm about to say? No, I don't think he's thinking this way. But the unintended consequences is all of a sudden now Denmark and NATO is paying much more attention to what Russia is doing. They are increasing their spending for their arms, which is something that we've been asking for. So is Trump's methodology something I would embrace? No. Is it getting some of the consequences that we would like to see happen because of the realities we're dealing with? It seems to be so. And that's what my German friend, who's just shaking his head, saying it is getting some positive movement, although, he's creating a lot of enemies where he shouldn't have to.
And maybe the message is one, if we do it at all, I want to stay away from politics, maybe the time has come, I agree with all the things that you say, that the time has now come to reward friends that have been your friends from the past. Do not alienate them, as your friends say. Don't make enemies out of your friends. And they're desperately trying not to do it. So I want to come back to some other things that we should be talking about, is that on World War II Holocaust, what is one of the major misconceptions people still have about the Holocaust and the World War II that your research corrects? And I'm thinking in particular, what always comes to mind is Buchenwald's, is Arbeit macht frei, and the opening to it, and all the other things. And we have obviously many, many stories of that. Share your thoughts with us.
So, Arbeit macht frei, that was a German phrase, work will set you free. And obviously the sick humor the Germans had with that, it's on the gate at Auschwitz, it's on the gate at Dachau, it's on the gate of Sachsenhausen. These are concentration camps or death camps. The misconception is that what happened in Germany is unique. Now, I think it was unique in the sense that they were so efficient in slaughtering 6 million Jews in only a few years, and that they used an industrial complex to do so with Zyklon B, poison gas, and crematoriums, etc. That is unique. But mass murder and having intolerance and bad ideologies motivate good people to do bad things. I think you see that in spades throughout history. And what Nazi Germany shows us is that we have to be ever vigilant in our societies, even democracy, because Weimar Republic, the political setup in Germany before Hitler, was a democracy. So we have to be very careful and realize the line between a civilized human being and a monster is very small, and that everybody has the potential to be extremely intolerant and brutal. In fact, if we go back through our ancestries, we will all find grandfathers that were humane and kind and good, and others that were absolutely brutal, bloodthirsty, intolerant, and fascist, if you will, intolerant thinking. So we need to realize that we come from this heritage, that we can go both ways, depending on what country, what government we're born under, what type of religion we're given. And we need to be embracing good education. We need to embrace tolerance within the political spectrum, and having both sides be heard. We need to have the balance of power, where there's checks and balances. Our founding fathers really knew that. And so I think the misconception, getting back to your question about Nazi Germany, is that this is something that was so unique it could never happen again. Well, we see that it continues to happen all the time. Rwanda genocide, we have black Hutus slaughtering black Tutsis, and they were all Catholic. And it's because of this kind of weird type of ethnicity that one had more Dutch, quote unquote, blood than the other. And that was only, 3 decades ago. We're having, these situations going on in Sudan where nobody's talking about the Muslim nut jobs that are killing all the Christians there. Or Nigeria, for that matter, Muslim nut jobs there. Boko Haram killing Christians. We have a serious problem in society, and quite frankly, most of the chaos and the terrorists that we're seeing out there are from Muslims. And so where I would be saying in 1933, we got to fight fascists in Nazi Germany and fascist Italians, fascist Spaniards. Now I'm saying, man, we got to look at fascist Islamic regimes, and we have serious problems there. And that's when also this misconception of the Holocaust, that once we took out these nations and then rebuilt them as democracies, we'll never see these bad actions again. But we continually are seeing them, and we're seeing them now, and we're not doing enough because they continue to happen. One thing that I'm really proud about American Jewish Committee's work with governments. And one thing that Trump did in his first term, from what I understand with Secretary of Defense General Mattis, is that for 8 years, Obama allowed ISIS to run rampant in Iraq and Syria. And they were killing for all intents and purposes, a fairly peaceful people called the Yazidis. They were a polytheistic religious group, very harmless, not armed, and these Muslims were going in there slaughtering them because they were infidels. We neutered ISIS when Trump changed the procedures of how you engage with their leaders and just killed them and got rid of them, and we saved the Yazidis. So we are doing some good there. We helped in Kosovo, saving Muslims from Serbian Orthodox Christian nut jobs under Milosevic and so on. So we have presidents that we can stop this. We know where it's happening, but we're not doing enough. And I think that's also a misconception from World War II, is that, man, we did a great job back then, it won't ever happen again. We have to realize this is happening all the time. And then what do we do? What is our responsibility? What's our moral responsibility of getting involved? And so this is something I think that is a misconception, that once we got that taken care of, we can wash our hands of it. And I think that's one reason why Trump and America has gone after Iran so much, is that they are a genocidal regime. They are calling death to all Americans and death to all Jews and ethnicity. And that is something that history tells us we got to take serious and take them out.
And I believe most people in the world would agree, at least in the free world, democratic world, that Iran is brutal. And the same as the Taliban in Afghanistan and some of the other ones. But comes to mind, Ryan, when we look at how can we collectively, as a global population, stabilize some of these things and preempt them or prevent them, and then looking at the United Nations, which was established, you probably know better than I do, was it in the 60s, or when was the United Nations established?
I don't know the exact date. When NATO was right after World War II. Obviously.
Yeah, that was, but the United...
When the UN came in was later, but I don't know exact date.
I believe in around the 60s, and I believe there are probably 260 or so countries involved, or something like that. Mm-hmm. It appears to me in a lot of cases that the United Nations, because of its structure, and there are 4 or 5 people that have the ability. I know you're looking up the date, so let me know when it was.
I am.
So that have a veto power, 3 or 4 different countries, and it appears to me that it has not been overly effective in terms of its structure, and partially because of there are so much different opinions that are based on so many issues that most of the things that happen will be vetoed by somebody that has veto power. I don't know how many there are, 4 or 5. And so it really has not been overly effective in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at, like, for example, the behavior in Somalia, with the UN, or the behavior of Somalia and Yugoslavia with the Civil War. They're really a bleeding sheep, and they don't have effective chain of command, and they are not willing to use violence when they see violence. So they're a very weak organization as far as implementing what they are saying they are trying to promote, which is peace, intolerance, and so on. So, that you have to empower them much more than what we've seen in the past. And like you said, when you have so many people that are deciding things by committee, it creates a lack of decisive action. It almost reminds me of, to somewhat, what Ronald Reagan said is, sometimes the most horrifying thing you can hear is that I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. Because you have to go through so many different layers to get that help. And I think the UN needs to be changed up in that way, that when they have policing actions going on, that they empower their officers on the ground to be able to utilize air, power and the resources on the ground to stop the brutality that you see going on in the cases, like I said, in Somalia and Yugoslavia are two cases, or Kosovo, where they didn't do anything. They just watched. And part of that is because of their mandate. They were just to watch and report. And I don't think that's a good thing. If you're going to have United Nations that embrace the democratic ideals, you start seeing groups of people being slaughtered because of their ethnicity or their religious beliefs and so on, you got to step in. And they're not doing it.
Yeah. And then the other part, in terms of what you already said earlier, most people can become brutal, and that's what man is all about. And if I look back, I was born in Holland, as you know, so I have a Dutch background. The Dutch were brutal as well in the 1600s, 1700s. Dutch East Indian Company comes to mind. The Dutch were the first ones to...
King Leopold.
And another example.
The Congo, they think King Leopold in the Congo over 100 years ago killed around 12 million people. Nobody
Belgium.
talks about that. You still have statues of him up in Holland.
Yeah, and that was Leopold was Belgium, in the Congos, and as you said, many people died. So I must then wonder, and I hope you work with me on that, is saying, are things getting better as we go forward? And today is probably not a good day with all the things going on in the Middle East. Are we moving forward? Is there hope that things will stabilize, or will they go potentially the other way, that the door is open to another major war that could well become World War III?
Well, I sure hope a lot of these countries that are being attacked indiscriminately from Iran, that they grow a backbone and they fight back. Azerbaijan, Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc. And to have a world war, so to speak, that people are talking about. I don't know what the exact definition is. How many countries do you have to have a world war? Does it have to go over a certain amount of continents, et cetera, et cetera? But taking out Iran is a good thing. Bombing its infrastructure and its government and its military to the ground is a good thing. Getting to your question, and I appreciate the vote of confidence here. Are we getting better? Yes. And I think, not to be too simplistic, but nations under common law and democratic institutions usually thrive. You have the ability to put away wealth. You embrace peace within your borders, and you're not killing people indiscriminately, for religious beliefs, ethnicities, etc. So that's examples that how just in the last couple hundred years, the world has gotten a lot stronger and better, having nations like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, America, Canada, England, Germany, etc.
I agree.
Where, a couple hundred years ago, these nations a lot of times were brutal in how they behaved. So we are getting better in some respects. The unknown is the nuclear war, war capabilities of bad nations like
Correct.
North Korea, Russia, and China.
Correct.
And we have enough nuclear warheads to destroy the Earth multiple times over, more than the asteroid did 65 million years ago that took out the dinosaurs.
Exactly.
So we have to be vigilant with that. And if we can't, we missed an opportunity to really neuter Russia when the fall of communism happened in 89, 90, and 91, and really get rid of those nuclear warheads. Truman missed a huge opportunity of bringing North Korea and South Korea together. He also missed another huge opportunity of not supporting Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists against Mao Tse-tung. We could have had a democratic China had we put more resources into that conflict, but we were just tired of supporting a corrupt democratic, quote-unquote, leader, Chiang Kai-shek, but he was a heck of a lot better than what we see with Mao Tse-tung and his legacy.
No question about that. I have to be now approaching the end of our program, and I have to take us, you and me, in a different direction.
Sure.
ADHD I'm ADHD and I have dyslexia. And
Me too.
so we do both. So ADHD and dyslexia, neurodiversity. Why is ADHD and dyslexia, and that's what I call it, a superpower? And what are the evolutionary reason humans have these conditions?
Thanks, John. I did a 25-year study of this because I have ADHD and dyslexia. My 3 children from my first marriage have some forms of these acronyms with their lives. And so when I looked at my own life and what helped me be successful and get into Yale University and Cambridge and write books, because I'm dyslexic, I'm like a glutton for punishment, it's a struggle to write and think and put words together. So I studied it from my own personal life, what helped me, and then what helped me help my children and them be successful. So why is it a superpower? And what's the evolution background that makes it so? I think I'm the first one in my book, Conquering Learning Disabilities, that's been endorsed by Ned Hallowell, one of the foremost experts of ADHD at Harvard University. He also wrote the foreword to the book. As a historian, I wanted to know, why do we have this in mankind's, in the society and in mankind's genetic material? And I actually sent this off to Christopher Stinger, one of the head scientists at the National History Museum in London. He wrote Lone Survivors about the Homo sapiens and Neanderthals especially. He's a brilliant mind. And I asked his endorsement, and he said, "You're onto something, Bryan." So to make a long story short, to kind of encourage my brother and sister ADHD and dyslexic comrades out there, I believe mankind, Homo sapiens, who've been around for about 200,000 years, the first 190,000 years, everybody was ADHD and dyslexia. Why is that? They are superior hunters, and they have great energy. And ADHD is not that you have a deficit in paying attention to things, it's that you pay attention to everything. And as a hunter, you want to be able to scan everything and then be able to hyperfocus. Also dyslexia, which is interesting. You flip, letters around on the page and whatnot. But when you're in the wild and you're flipping things, you can see nuances in the forest, on the paths. In fact, they found the best astrophysicists out there are dyslexic, because when they're looking at the telescope, they're flipping things in their mind's eye and they can see better detail. Also with ADHD, the drive of being a hunter and so on, there's 3 populations that I found that have the highest level of ADHD and dyslexia out there. Special Forces, which you were part of in the Dutch Army, and I was in the Marine Corps, fighter pilots, and prison. Because if you don't get the outlet of getting your adrenaline fix, because that's what ADHD people need. They need high adrenaline activity, stimulation, entrepreneurs like you with the lumber industry. I have my own company. If you don't get it in healthy ways, you can go down the road of addiction and bad behavior, racing cars, drugs, et cetera, et cetera. So what I developed researching this is that about 10,000 years ago, we had the agricultural revolution when we started growing our food. We were much more efficient with populations as far as having children and feeding them with the agricultural revolution. And the farming communities have different DNA than us. In fact, according to Stinger, about 7% of our DNA has changed just in the last 10,000 years. And these farming communities overwhelm hunting communities. Think of what happened in North America with the Indian tribes and so on. You get a farming community coming in, they overwhelm the hunting communities. That used to be what all mankind at one time was. That ensured survivability, how to be a good hunter, how to be a good gatherer, and so on. And the people who were far superior in that were ADHD and dyslexic. Only in the last 10,000 years has that not been the trait that you need to really build out society and survive. It's been more so how you deal with city-states and growing. So why is ADHD and dyslexia a superpower? If you hone it and you use it for good, these are the people that make, inventions. They are entrepreneurs. They're good leaders. They're zany. They have crazy imagination. And I believe you're going to find this interesting, John. This is fascinating. The general population of Homo sapiens is about 3% are ADHD, dyslexia, except for two nations, basically, or two areas, I should say. And that is Australia and Canada and America. Because the people who had the guts to go out and be immigrants were quite often the rejects in their own societies. They were prisoners. I mean, America was a penal colony and Australia was a penal colony of the British Empire. And these two areas, the ADHD and dyslexia, according to some demographic studies that I've done, are at 20%. And that's why we have entrepreneurs and we have inventions and we have this new form of government.
I believe
that is part and parcel why these nations are so successful. So this is one part of my book of showing just how positive ADHD is and dyslexia. And when people realize you just have a different brain, it's ancient man's brain, and it is an incredible superpower, you change the perception of what this is. And the worst learning disability is poor self-esteem. And quite often ADHD and dyslexic people have poor self-esteem. Once you tell them, hey, you're not different, you're not a freak, you're not deficit in anything, that's the beginning of healing, and then embracing these things as weapons in your tool chest that you can use to be successful in life.
I love it, Bryan, because if I look back as this nearly 86-year-old guy, young, I call it, I was not, having gone through the Second World War, suffered far too much, had PTSD, and a child, failed grade 3, failed grade 7 3 times, and then they said to my parents, what are you going to do with this guy? They said, send him to the mentally challenged school. They said, no, we're not going to do that. But I had my dream. I knew I could do it, and I wanted to start with nothing, come to Canada and build my dream. I did that. And so starting with nothing, and not in spite of ADHD, because of it. And so I agree with you 100%. I have 6 books that I wrote. I'm a very active speaker. I have 6 or 7 different companies, blah, blah, blah. And then obviously I'm very successful in podcasting, as we both do. And for all those people watching us, watch Bryan. Let me know where your books are. You have how many books? And where can they get them?
I have 7 books out there. Thank you so much, John. They can get them on Amazon.com. So the book we just talked about is called Conquering Learning Disabilities at Any Age. And then the other 2 books that we kind of touched upon that helped me come to a lot of the conclusions I have from a geopolitical point of view is Hitler's Jewish Soldiers and Japan's Holocaust. And they're all found on Amazon.com.
And check it out with Bryan, and then subscribe to the podcast if you like what you saw on my podcasting and anything that Bryan does. Like it if you like it, comment on it if you wish, share it with others. And again, Bryan, this was an amazing podcast, and I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you, John, for having me. It was an honor to be here.
Bryan, this podcast will not be edited. We will release it within 2 hours to all the people that you know, and I hope you enjoy it. And let's make sure we stay in touch, though. And in about 6 months from now, we're going to contact. We got so much more to talk about. We're going to contact you again for another podcast.
Hey, just let's go ahead and get it on the calendar, John, and I look forward to it.
Thanks, Bryan. Take care.
Thank you, John. All the best to you.
Best to you.